afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the closing event and catastrophe model launch of the Oasis project. My name is Sherwin, and I will be your host for today. We cap off 2 years of the Oasis project, in which partners co-develop a new and open access catastrophe model for flood in the Philippines and help build capabilities on catastrophe modeling among local stakeholders. Speakers from the private sector and the government will deliver presentations on flood risk, flood management, and flood data collection in the Philippines, the benefits of catastrophe models in risk-informed decision-making, and how the project's output, the catastrophe model for flood, will be available to local stakeholders. And just a few reminders before we begin. This session is being recorded for future viewing. To ensure the smooth course of the event, everyone other than the host and speakers will be kept on mute. You may communicate with us and other co-hosts using the Zoom's chat function. Questions will be entertained at the end of the program, but due to time constraints, we will not be taking audio questions. But instead, you may type in your questions or comments in the chat or Q&A box below addressed to questions. There will be a quick photo op at the end of the program, so may I kindly request everyone to stay for a few minutes after the entire presentation. If you need assistance, please send a chat message to any of the co-hosts. We have Ir Aini Manyo, Rico Calince, questions, and myself, Sherwin, or email us at oasis@nat-re.com. And now, to formally open the program, let us all welcome President and CEO of the National Reinsurance Corporation of the Philippines, or NATRE, Mr. Alan Santos.
Thank you, Sherwin. Oasis LMF CEO, Mr. Dicky Whitaker, Oasis LMF Director, Dr. Claire Sauch, Pag-asa Hydrometeorology Division Planning Officer, Engineer Socrates Paat, Makati City Head of Research and Planning, Ms. Liza Ramos, UP Department of Geodetic Engineering Assistant Professor, Engineer Louis Vallejanta, UP DREAM Chief Science Research Specialist, Engineer John Fabula, Katrisk Managing Director, Mr. Stefan Eppert, Willis Towers Watson Capital Science and Policy Practice Managing Director, Mr. David Simmons. Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to this culminating event of the Oasis project. About 2 years ago, we launched this project to bring together the government, academe, nonprofit, development, and insurance sectors for developing the first open access catastrophe model for flood in the Philippines. The project also aimed to build long-term capacity among participants in the Philippines to develop, understand, and use catastrophe models. And after much hard work and collaboration between the various sectors, from learning about catastrophe models and their uses, to collecting and understanding the data, to creating and testing the model, we now come to this stage of launching the catastrophe model for flood in the Philippines. The relevance of this work product is underlined by the recent typhoons Raleigh and Ulysses, whose floods have brought much devastation to the country. It is our fervent hope that the flood model will facilitate the development of risk transfer products to help narrow the gap between insured and uninsured losses, as well as extend its use beyond the insurance industry for risk-informed decision-making. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all the partners and participants to the project, for without their support, we would have not made it to this stage. This afternoon, we will hear from various distinguished speakers, and they will talk about, among others, the flood risk in the Philippines context, the risk management initiatives and approaches that are applied, the available tools and technology for understanding flood risk, the advantages of open source platforms, where or how the flood model outputs could be of use, and how the model will be rolled out to the various potential users. I'd like to thank the speakers in advance for taking the time and effort to discuss with us today. So without further ado, allow me to turn you over back to Sherwin and wish you all a productive and worthwhile afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alan Santos. The first presentation in our program is on the benefits of international and open source standards and models and the Oasis Platform. Our presenter has over 30 years of experience in the insurance and reinsurance industry. For the last 20 years, he has been specializing in risk and innovation and in linking the academe, the government, and the finance sectors. I am pleased to introduce our speaker, the CEO of Oasis Loss Modelling Framework, Mr. D.K. Whitaker.
Sherwin, thank you very, very much for the introduction. And Alan, thank you as well for your kind comments, much appreciated. So I just want to set the scene a little bit about why this is so important. And you need to understand perhaps a little bit about how the understanding of risk works around the world today. And unfortunately, the reality is it's not very joined up. It's in silos. The insurance industry uses certain types of systems. Governments often use others. And other parts of society end up by using the data and information they can find and have available. It's very inefficient. It's very costly. And in many cases, actually, countries around the world have to reach out to expensive consulting firms located in Europe or the United States, all of which is really not a very good system and not a very good idea. So the vision that we had was to try and change that and bring that to two countries, the Philippines and to Bangladesh, which are both part of the project funded by the German government. And through some amazing dedication and leadership from the team at NatRe and many government departments in the Philippines, and with Claire's strong project leadership and the help of Katrisk, I think what we've got is an amazing situation where between the Philippines and Bangladesh, we've probably got the only countries in the world that have this partnership that has government and academia and the insurance industry promoting the use of these models, co-developing the use of these models, and making them available to people who need them, particularly in the insurance industry, but outside as well. And earlier this week, I was on a call to many of the banks in the Philippines who were very interested in learning how they could also use these techniques pioneered by the insurance industry to help understand credit risk and the risk to mortgage default in the banking sector as well. So what I think you're going to hear today is how much work has been done and how useful it could be. What's critical, and I'd like to leave you with this thought, what's critical is how can we make sure that we continue to grow and use and develop the products that have been made available during the course of this project, because that's going to be the real test of value to each of you and many of you not on this call and to the people of the Philippines. So I'd like to thank actually the leadership that came from Alan and the team at NatRe. Without you, I think this project would have been almost impossible to do. So I hope everybody enjoys the rest of the conversation. Please think about how you can use this in the future. And I hope this is a very productive day and look forward to listening to the rest of the afternoon's presentations. So thank you very, very much to everybody. Sherwin, and back to you.
Thank you, Mr. D.K. Whitaker. The second presentation is on the outputs of the Oasis project and how to use them for disaster risk reduction and disaster risk finance applications. Our presenter has 20 years of experience in catastrophe risk model development and usage across the global insurance and reinsurance industry. She serves on multiple industry task forces on catastrophe and risk modeling and disaster risk financing. Let us welcome our speaker, Program Director at Oasis Loss Modelling Framework, Dr. Claire Sauch.
Thank you. Thank you for that kind introduction. I'll just share a few slides here. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is just share my perspective gained over the last several years of bridging between public and private sectors in the context of disaster risk finance, but also other applications of the types of models that we've built, that we build and use in the reinsurance industry, and just share a few thoughts about that for everyone on the call, particularly those of you who are not very familiar with these types of models and some of the terminology we use as well in the insurance industry. Now, of course, the background, I don't need to go into this a lot. You know, everyone's very familiar with this. Disaster losses continuing to increase. Philippines, it's estimated, is vulnerable to an average of well over $3 billion of disaster losses on average every year. And of course, in some years, that's significantly more. For example, in 2013, where Typhoon Haiyan resulted in an estimated 12 billion or more US dollars. And these types of extreme losses very quickly exhaust the available risk management funds that have been put in place to cover significant disasters and can impact significantly government budgets. I mean, it's also the private sector and individuals who are left to really bear the majority of these losses. And I think it was estimated that about 80% of that damage and that loss from the typhoon did fall on the private sector to cover and absorb those losses. So we know that insurance is a very well recognized mechanism to help with the speeding up. Very fast post-disaster payouts can help speed up recovery and increase resilience. It also helps through the incentivization of risk reduction through sending price signals and rewarding risk reduction through impacts on premiums, of course. But I think it's important to recognize, and one of the things we're trying to achieve with this project, is that the models and data and analysis that are used to underpin insurance are also really useful in a whole variety of other contexts for risk management strategies. So this information helps the setting of building codes, which can drive building codes and post-disaster reconstruction to build back better. The information can help with preparedness and forecast-based financing, which payouts before an event actually hits. It will inform policy development and investment in both structural and non-structural measures for example, cost-benefit analysis of investment in new flood defenses, for example. So the information and the interface that we've been building through the Oasis platform can help in a variety of different applications, different government departments, and different uses. So as has already been mentioned by many speakers, you know, what we set out to do here was to develop this information in a new way and to make it available to all, which has not been the case in the past. And we've been able to do that by having a very collaborative I would truly call it a co-development approach, where we've had international expertise in climate modeling from PIC, from Potsdam, in catastrophe modeling from Katrisk. And they've come together with scientists from Pagasa, from the University of Philippines, and of course with colleagues from NatRe and Willis, bringing the private sector data into the thing. And through this co-development, I think we both gained an improvement in the end result, because this model actually truly reflects local data and local engineering expertise in a way that no model for the Philippines has done before. And also it's transferred knowledge about how you develop and use climate and catastrophe models through to end users in both the public and private sector, through the development process and through the workshops that we've been running. And so we've developed capacities, we've developed a public-private collaboration, and this information will hopefully support the development of new products, particularly for flood, which are seriously lacking in the country. And I would say as well, the completion of this project, we've completed a lot of technical work. We've developed a model that will be delivered on the Oasis open source platform. But I would say that launch is now the beginning of many decisions that could be made using this information now and new product development. Now, for those of you less familiar with the terminology that we're talking about, catastrophe models, the term applies to a very specific type of risk model that has been developed and used in the industry, the reinsurance industry, for the last 30 years to overcome the problem that historical experience and data is very limited, particularly in countries like the Philippines, and also because the risk is changing so fast. What happened 5, 10 or 15 years ago does not reflect current or the future disaster risk. So the model that we produced, there will actually be 2 versions of it, one to reflect the current climate, and then another version which includes future climate change projections from the climate models run by Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Impact, so that you can analyze how risk is today and how it might be in the future. So these models give us a robust way to estimate the average expected losses and the probability of large losses, return periods for hundreds of years. And they're critical, they're absolutely critical for reinsurance, risk-based pricing, risk transfer, capital management, and so on. But they can also be used for risk monitoring and risk reduction decisions. So, for example, because the model analyses can be rerun relatively quickly, and through the toolkit we've built, end users, anyone, can change data inputs to this model. They can change assumptions of this model. So, for example, you can change flood defense protection levels and see what the impact is on expected losses. You can output risk zones, look at hazards, how hazard changes by geography, to look at where should development happen in the future and where shouldn't, building codes and so on. And lots of this information could be used in other tools as well outside of the Oasis platform. So the project is nearly finished. It's the official end of our project is the end of December. And the modeling and the Oasis platform will be made available in early 2021. And others on this presentation will talk more about exactly how that's going to happen. And there's already a number of discussions underway about how this output is going to be used in the Philippines. So, for example, insurance for flood coverage can be developed, and inland flood, for example, flooding for cities that comes from many sources, obviously typhoons being a major source of flood risk for the country, but there are other flooding events that happen outside of the typhoons. So flood insurance can be developed for the first time, really. And that really is already taking leadership on that. New cat bonds covering flood can be created. There's already been quite a lot of good work on this from the World Bank and the Asian Development Banks in creating risk pools for other perils, and they're looking to add flood to those perils. And as I say, cost-benefit analysis, for example, of new flood defences. Today, looking at the impact on today risk and future risk, there's a whole range of applications there of the economic cost and benefits of climate change adaptation analysis that can happen, and pretty quickly using this catastrophe model framework and the model update kit that we're delivering. And really importantly as well, actors within the country will have the long-term ability not just to use this model on an ongoing basis, but also update it and build new ones through the tools that we've built. So agencies such as the science partners on this, Pagasa University in Philippines, can input new data and assumptions to reflect the changing risk landscape, and they can build models themselves. Therefore, it's making the Philippines self-sufficient in risk modeling and solving that problem that Dickie talked about earlier of no longer having to come to consultants based in the UK or Europe or the US. So that's been a major goal, is to give this capability to update this model and to build new models in the long term without even having to come back to us. So that's a brief overview. There's further information available on the Oasis website. Here are some links. You can, of course, contact Oasis and NatRe in the future. There are lots of demos and webinars on the Oasis YouTube channel, training videos that we've been putting together over the last couple of years. And all of the platform documentation and software information is, of course, open source and free to use and free to access from these links. So with that, I hope that's given you some insights into how the outputs of this project, when they'll be available and how they'll be useful for different sectors. And with that, Sherwin, I'll pass back to you for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Claire Sauch. The next presentation is supposed to be from Pag-asa, Engineer Socrates Junpaat, but he's encountering some technical issues. So we will get back to him. So for now, the next presentation is on the University of the Philippines flood data collection methods and how these are used in various projects and initiatives. Our presenters serve as the chair of the department and director of the Training Center for Applied Geodesy and Photogrammetry from 2017 to 2020. He was involved in different research projects with DOST's National LiDAR Program, with NAMRIA's research on the modernization of the Philippine Geodetic Reference System, and with DENR's Land Sector Modernization Research projects. He was awarded as the 2018 and 2019 Most Outstanding Geodetic Engineer in Academe for his exemplary efforts in supporting the programs of Geodetic Engineers of the Philippines Incorporated. He earned his bachelor's degree in Geodetic Engineering and master's degree in Urban and Regional Planning, both from the University of the Philippines, Diliman. Let us welcome our speaker, Assistant Professor at the Geodetic Engineering Department in UP Diliman, Engineer Louis Vallejanta.
Good afternoon for the kind introduction. Sharing my slides. So I'll be methods in generating the university did with UST, and the outputs were shared to a project Oasis. So basically, it's a combination with methodology, new methodology, and the people the appropriate spatial data or spatial information for different purposes and processing of the data. So with the LiDAR, we've used
Do we have Engineer Louis Vallejanta? Are we still on? All right, I think Engineer Louis Vallejanta is also experiencing some technical issues.
hello,
But I think he's back.
Sherwin.
Yeah, we can
Hearing
hear
na
you
ba
now.
ako? Am I
Yes.
being heard?
Yes, and we can see your presentation.
Okay.
You may proceed. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. So we have LiDAR technology used. We have airborne data topography the main technology used was the airborne. We do fly on the different areas, focusing on the flood plain areas in the Philippines. So 100% of the areas in the Philippines were covered through LiDAR. Okay. And then we did ground surveys to validate our LiDAR data sets, wherein we use GNSS receivers to obtain a validation data to generate the needed uh, equation to set the to say if the data that we've obtained is accurate enough for our purpose. We did cross-section survey, and since LiDAR cannot penetrate through water at certain depths, certain quality of water, we needed this survey so that we can, for example, this bathymetric data, and combine it with the LiDAR data to provide a more complete information consisting of the underwater topography and the surface topography. And this was done by people in the office. No, they process, they edited, they do picture extraction for the structures and then the buildings. Okay, this is then the output of this LiDAR data processing is the input for the flood modeling by another group. So the final output can probably be similar to this one with the digital surface model, wherein the building can be seen, and through okay, we can remove the built environment, the built structure, and only the bare land can be seen. No? Or so this digital elevation model is the input information for uh, by the experts, no, in flood modeling. So the idea in flood modeling is that we try to generate also hydrologic information by placing different sensors. No, we placed a rain gauge sensor downstream, and then we placed and do measurements of and that measurement the time it will spend the water, no, to travel from the upstream going to the downstream, wherein there is high risk for flooding. Okay, so the idea here is that with the topography that we've obtained from LiDAR, accurate enough so that we can turn the different elevations, no, as compared to a less accurate topographic information, we can provide the flood modeling a suitable topographic information wherein we can say that it is a half a meter, 1 meter, or 2 meters deep of a flood inundation. So after data gathering and processing of this, probably of the output wherein we try to model based on the actual this observed on the field, model it, and produce this hydrograph, no, comparison between the HMS depth changes versus the actual changes this hazard maps. So this flood hazard maps in 5 years, 50
Engineer Louis Vallejanta. Are we still on?
Sherwin, can you hear me?
Y- yes, we can hear you now. And I think we've lost it again.
Hello, Sherwin.
Yes, sir, Louis.
Okay, just a few more slides. No,
It's okay. Probably, Sir Louis,
so
you
this flood hazard map.
yeah, sorry, Sir Louis. Probably it might help if you would like to turn off your video. Hopefully, it will help.
Okay. Seven 100-year period, we were able to communicate to check if the results are really flooding. There's flooding in their area. So one of the explaining to them how this included there is the development of a flood advisory system where a situation wherein they have
Engineer Louis.
hello
Yes. Yeah, sorry, Sir Louis. I
Sherwin.
think yeah, I think
Hello.
you're having a
Okay. So I think that's the last of the slide, Sherwin. Okay.
all right.
Summary. Okay, we've used LiDAR technology, GNSS technology.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, the different methodologies employed, and then the people. Okay, to produce a topographic information that can be used in flood modeling, and also I think this was used. All of these were used in the generation of the Oasis project model, no, the catastrophe risk assessment model for the Philippines in certain areas here in the Philippines. With that, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Okay, thank you and good day.
It's all right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Engineer Louis Vallejanta. And now, our next presentation is on flood risks in the Philippines. Our presenter has more than 25 years of experience as hydrologist, flood forecaster, and project or task leader for several local and foreign assisted projects. Let us welcome our speaker, Planning Officer at the Hydrometeorology Division at the Philippine Atmospheric, Geophysical, and Astronomical Services Administration or PAGASA, Engineer Socrates June Paat Jr.
For all we know, flooding is one of the most expensive natural disasters, not only in the Philippines, but globally, costing trillions of dollars. And when we talk about flood risk, we deal with so many factors, from its causes, reasons why an area has high risk of flooding, to mitigating, managing the risk, and so on. But one thing is for sure, we cannot totally eliminate the risk of flooding. Shown here is the big picture of the risk the world is facing. So this is the World Risk Index as reported by the International Science Council. This involves all the natural disasters. They can be floods, landslides, earthquakes, and so on. As you can see, roughly 30% of the world is under medium to high risk. That is 5 to 36 index points. As shown in these tables, WRIs for 2011 and 2015 respectively, the Philippines has been consistently in number 3, even increasing in index points by 3 points from that of 2011. And as flood is the biggest cause of natural disaster in the Philippines, as you can see in this slide, the big factor why we are at number 3 in WRI is of course flood risk. As you can see, holding the record high in terms of number of deaths is the flood in Ormoc City due to Typhoon Uring in 1991 with casualties of more than 8,000. When you search for the record of the other high flood casualties, there are conflicting data and information. But what is evident is that flood casualties have relatively gone down, proof of which is the recent spate of floods and landslides in the country, culminating with Typhoon Ulysses last November. If we total the number of casualties due to these 7 tropical cyclones, it would total to nearly 125. And why then is the Philippines prone to flood? The answer is clear. Most of the ingredients, quote unquote, are present. Most weather-causing phenomena are experienced here in our country. For tropical cyclones, we have 20 of them each year on the average. In terms of topography, the country's landscape formed a total of 18 major or very large river basins, as well as hundreds of smaller ones. And it is in these river basins where the classic historical floodings occurred and may still occur. The Philippine government's scheme to face the challenges of flood is a two-pronged mechanism. They are classified as structural and non-structural. Structural, as the term implies, is the construction of structures for purposes of reducing the upstream runoff inflow, preventing or diverting flow in some cases. And these are the dams and reservoirs, retarding basins, floodways that we create, the embankments, the dikes, channel improvements, to name a few others. In simple terms, structural measures are meant to move water away from the people, while non-structural measures move people away from the water. So these are the non-structural measures that we have implemented in our country. We have flood forecasting and warning, where I myself has been a part of in most of my professional career. Together with some other national and local government agencies, we have implemented community-based adaptation or CBA, highlighting with the so-called CBFUS or community-based flood early warning system. We also need to adapt to climate change, and so we have CBA measures to do so. Flood hazard mapping and zoning are also very effective non-structural measures discussed a while ago by Louis Vallejanta. Not so popular yet in our country, but is a bright way forward, is the flood insurance system. In the US, through its FEMA, or the Federal Emergency Management Agency, is already implementing this. In the Philippines, there has been several initiatives for flood insurance mechanism, but I haven't known of substantial achievements. And thanks to the partnership forged between the National Reinsurance Corporation, the University of the Philippines, of course, the OST Pag-asa, and some other key government and non-government agencies, we now have a brighter future ahead in terms of flood insurance as a non-structural flood mitigation scheme through the project Oasis. This is in line with the Sendai framework, the Paris Agreement, and the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And as a commitment of my agency, Pag-asa TOST, shown here is an original slide from a country presentation, which we have presented in one of the uh, symposia held under the AOGO, the Asia Oceania Group on Earth Observation, held in Canberra, Australia last year. So you see, we have included here Oasis project in our Philippine Roadmap Strategic Way for Global Agenda. So with that, I thank you for the opportunity. Thank you very much and good afternoon.
Thank you so much, Engineer Socrates Jun Paat. The next presentation is on flood risk management in Metro Manila, particularly in the city of Makati. Our presenter is a licensed environmental urban planner with more than a decade of work in the field of disaster risk reduction and management. She is about to complete her master's degree in disaster risk and crisis management at the Asian Institute of Management. She is instrumental in formalizing the partnership between Pag-asa and the city government for the early warning system project of Makati. She is keen in ensuring harmonization of plans and protocols from international down to local entities, as well as finding the nexus between science and practice. Let us welcome our speaker, Research and Planning Division Head of the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Office, or DRRMO, of the City Government of Makati, Ms. Lizabel Ramos.
Thank you so much, sir. I am really humbled to be with this roster of speakers today. I am not an expert in risk catastrophe modeling, but I believe Makati has a fair share of mitigating flood risks in the city with the use of science and data. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me share with you Makati's story in around 20 slides, but I will try to make it fast. First, let me give you an overview of Makati. Our city is known as the business and financial center of the country. It is at the heart of the national capital region. Most of the main offices of big corporations, embassies, and consulates are housed in Makati. In fact, our local population of roughly 600,000 balloons up to 4 million during daytime because of the various activities these industries provide. Geographically, the city has 33 barangays. We have 2 congressional districts. The first district is how Makati is seen by many. It's where the commercial business district is located. In terms of land area, we have a total of 2,700 hectares, and within and on the boundaries of the city are creeks and the Pasig River. On this next slide, you will see our flood hazard map and risk information. Makati is exposed to a 200-year return flood cycle period as our worst case scenario. We are anticipating 2.6 meters of inundation near river and creeks, around 90,000 affected people, and 1.7 million pesos of damaged floor cost. Note that this risk information were based on data in year 2013 to 2014. But nevertheless, this gives a picture of the potential impact of a worst-case flooding scenario in Makati based on scientific studies. And you will notice that flood occurrence is rampant in the boundaries of Makati and near creeks like the one at the center. And this map is not actually that different in our climate scenario. In a study, Makati could expect a 7-meter sea level rise with inundation almost in similar areas as that of our worst-case flooding scenario. And what I will show next are the historical flooding maps in Makati. This one is for Typhoon Ketsana or Ondoy. The next one is a flooding due to a southwest monsoon aggravated by Typhoon Haikui. We also have a flooding map for Typhoon Maring or Trami. And of course, the most recent one, Typhoon Ulysses or Vamco. And if your eyes are fast enough, I bet you will all agree that our areas near boundaries and creek sides are really flood prone areas, no? And so this flooding issues is addressed in our mother development plan. We have the comprehensive land use plan and zoning ordinance. Both of these consider the climate and disaster risks of the city in developing our comprehensive development strategies. And you can see on this slide some of the risk sensitive salient development strategies and provisions incorporated in our CLUP and zoning ordinance. But aside from spatial development, the city has various sectoral initiatives that ensure safety of our Makatizens and other stakeholders against flooding. Let me go through these interventions very fast and start with the Makati's early warning system. So basically, our early warning services is anchored across the four elements or components of early warning system. Starting off with risk knowledge, we recognize the expertise of the Weather and Climate Bureau of the country, which is of course PAG-ASA, in providing weather information. PAG-ASA is the source of official weather data that the city, through our office, localize and disseminate to the city's 33 barangays. We have actually forged formal partnership with PAG-ASA through a memorandum of understanding, and part of this partnership is determining the threshold value of Makati, a risk information that is important for us to now cast potential impacts of a weather system that is anticipated to affect the city. Ultimately, we'd like to have an impact-based forecasting and end-to-end system. Still, part of risk knowledge is imparting the scientific information to other city departments and even our barangays. We provide capacity building activities and collaborative dialogues to marry science and community experience or practice. On monitoring, we do have our 24 by 7 weather monitoring unit, and this unit works round the clock and provides localized weather advisories to our stakeholders on a daily basis. Aiding our weather monitoring team are some equipment that the city invested on. On this slide, you can see our 7 automated weather stations strategically situated across the city. The radius coverage of each of the AWS can actually cover the whole city. Complementing this are our automated rain gauges in about 16 sites. On this map are the locations of the 16 ARGs, identified with the help of our partner, of course, PAG-ASA. Some of these locations are relatively high in terms of topography, so water runoff can be forecasted based on rain rate recorded. You hopefully also notice the orange colored dot on the map, and this represents the sites for the water level sensors, which is actually in an ongoing installation at this phase. On dissemination and communication component, this slide just shows that we use various platforms. We, both city and the barangay, still have the public address system. We also use our social media platform for information dissemination. And perhaps what is most exciting to share is the Makatizen app. In this Makatizen app, there is an SOS button that when clicked, it will notify our operations center in a couple of seconds, and our dispatch personnel will immediately call the registered number. And speaking of operations center, our Makati C3 or Command, Control, and Communication Center still serves as our primary coordination and communication center for all types of emergencies and disasters. And you can see on this slide the vast network where exchanges of information and reports are taking place for preparedness and peak response. And for the last component, response interventions, you can see here resource prepositioning photos prior to an impact of a typhoon, as well as the presence of our contingency plan for hydromet hazards. But preparedness interventions, as we know, are not enough. Fortunately for Makati, there are disaster prevention and mitigation interventions that the different sectors and different agencies do. On this slide, you can see a number of practices we employ for environmental DRR CCA interventions. I will not go through this one by one because of time constraints. But on the next slide, it talks about our infrastructure interventions, particularly the drainage master planning project led by our Department of Engineering and Public Works. You will notice that the colored lines here representing the areas for drainage improvement can easily be spotted on the same areas where flooding occurs based on the flooding maps that I showed earlier. You will also notice red dots near Pasig River and the east side of the city near creeks. This represent proposed additional pumping station sites. This drainage master planning intervention is a work in progress for us, and we continue to do the scientific studies matched with our community knowledges, specifically on flooding incidents in the city. So in summary, our early warning system starts off with science, and we marry it with practice and community knowledge. I hope you also noticed how we ensure end-to-end service to prepare and protect our stakeholders against the impacts of typhoon and flooding by harmonizing and complementing efforts of various agencies, horizontal and vertical, in the city. We might have done so much already, but we know that there are still a lot to be done. And so, with the challenges that we continue to face, we want our way forward to consider all of this, but not necessarily only these things that you can see on this slide. I will not go through this one by one again because of time constraints, but what I want to discuss is, of course, one of the main subjects of this event. Nothing in my presentation have highlighted the city's investment in risk transfer mechanisms. I must admit, this is still one field that we have yet to uncover. There are small steps undertaken on this matter, like touching base with insurers and reinsurers. Hence, the conduct of the first ever microinsurance expo in the city some years ago back. We have also touched base with NATRE. Hence, our participation in some of the Oasis project activities, and perhaps also the reason why we are here. And we also hope to get the ball rolling on this aspect. In a worst case flooding scenario, as I have shared earlier, we have plans and protocols. And yes, we might be able to save lives and perhaps some important public assets. But how about the community, the businesses, the residents, the 1.7 million conservative economic loss based on damaged floor cost? How do we fund this if our businesses, which are the primary source of local revenue of the city, are affected? The Oasis project helped us realize this. And I hope after this closing event, partnerships established can be maintained and new partnerships can be forged. So let us continue collaborating. And I hope you learned something from me. And I hope I imparted with you the practical side, a local government perspective side in managing flood risks. If you want to know more, we have flashed our contact information earlier. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lizabel Ramos. Our next presentation is on using latest modeling technology to better understand flood risk in the Philippines. Our presenter is a hydrologist who worked for 6.5 years at Risk Management Solutions, or RMS, on the development of continental flood risk models, model implementation, and simulation methodologies. He is an avid technologist who is comfortable in multiple programming languages and their application to large-scale computational problems. Let us welcome our speaker, Managing Director and Co-founder at Katrisk, Mr. Stefan Eppert.
Hello, thank you very much, and let me share my screen. Okay, so we've heard a lot about flood risk and all the initiatives that are going on. And our task was to build the flood model for the Philippines for this project in conjunction with the local partners and the help from Oasis. So our task is to capture flooding from both strong precipitation and river inundation. To do that, we modeled 10,000 years of simulated climate, which is similar to current weather, and then track the losses that occur with that. And companies and stakeholders can use that to estimate the flood risk that they currently have. So we have a continuous simulation of weather and hydrology for these 10,000 years. We've got a tropical cyclone model, which slots in the tropical cyclones and their typical rainfall patterns. And then we model flood hazard at 30-meter resolution and build an event set from that. This is put onto the Oasis Loss Modelling platform, and then stakeholders like insurance companies or government agencies can put on their exposure, their list of buildings to be insured or thought at risk, and get a distribution of losses for their portfolio. The final thing that we have included in this project is the model update toolkit, which allows stakeholders to change the underlying model and not just the exposure. So I don't have time to delve into all the aspects of the model itself, of course, but let me give you an overview of some of the highlights. And I think the first one is that the model is conditioned, or the weather simulations are conditioned on global sea surface temperatures. That means we track the El Nino or ENSO state, and that allows us to keep track of which years have got a high number of tropical cyclones versus low numbers. And this will also allow you to subset the simulation years and get the risk for the current state of the atmosphere and the ocean. Yeah, the next thing is we've got explicit modeling of tropical cyclones and their rainfall system, as well as monsoon rain, frontal systems, and other sources of rain. Those are fed into rainfall runoff models and 2D inundation models. And at the bottom right, you see a picture of a flood risk map, which is using the LiDAR DTMs that Louis Vallejanta talked about. So this is using the UP Dream data. And finally, we will have climate change scenarios where we perturb the rainfall fields for given rainfall return period locally. And this is driven by simulations from GFZ Potsdam. So we take all these sources, we define events and put them onto the Oasis Loss Modelling platform. And this isn't, as Dicky talked about, and Claire, this is an open source system which allows you to, or allows us to transfer the tools from the insurance CAT modeling industry to other sectors. It allows both insurers and other stakeholders to use a tool where they know they will have long-term access. They can have complete ownership. They can also buy services around that to make things smoother. But I think the long-term viability is really helped by using open tools. And then the output you get if you put in your portfolios is this EP curve or CDF of losses for your risks. The last bit of the project, which I think is really innovative and which is something that even commercial clients for hazard models in other regions don't have, is the model update toolkit. And while the Oasis files are sort of the integrator of risk, and you see, you get the final output, the final distribution. The model update toolkit takes all the components that go into this, takes the hazard event sets, takes the local flood maps, takes the defense assumptions and the vulnerability curves, gives you access to all these parts to inspect and to change, and then allows you to rewrite a new hazard set for Oasis and run that with your portfolios and get the losses. So if you have additional data that we couldn't use, like the detailed data from the local governments that Ms. Ramos talked about, or if there's other new initiatives, the flood maps from UP Dream, you can put these in there and create your own model version. And this is, I think so far this is really one of a kind. Now, as you have heard, we are a bit behind schedule. It's been a challenging year. Currently, the test model has been shared with NetRe and other project partners. We are waiting their feedback and will then produce the final model early next year for everybody to use. Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stefan Eppert. The next presentation is on protecting property lives and livelihoods, risk transfer in the Philippines. Our presenter is a pioneer of catastrophe and capital modeling in the reinsurance industry. His recent works has been on parametric insurance schemes to provide immediate emergency response as soon as a catastrophe event occurs or is recognized. Let us welcome our speaker, Managing Director in the Capital Science and Policy Practice at Willis Towers Watson, Mr. David Simmons.
Well, firstly, it's an absolute pleasure to be talking to this erudite group. I was fortunate enough to be actually talking again to an audience in Manila on Friday, to a group of people at the Asian Development Bank. And it gave me the opportunity to reflect back on my career, if you like, and actually thinking about 30 years ago, I was working in the catastrophe reinsurance industry, and it looked like I'd made a terrible career choice. It looked like the industry was about to collapse. Lloyd's of London had been operating for over 300 years, never made a loss, looked like it was about to fold. And why was that? It's because we didn't understand the risks we faced. We didn't understand. We're writing billions of dollars of cover without fully understanding the properties we were covering and the hazards we were insuring. So, but now, 30 years later, despite climate change, despite more events, more catastrophes, despite more severe catastrophes, and despite COVID-19 and pandemics, we have a strong, robust global reinsurance industry, which is transformed from the industry which I joined 40 years ago. So it's a very, very different world, a very, very different environment. And why is that? That thriving market is predicated on modeling. It was modeling of natural hazards that changed the market. Suddenly we had a mechanism to understand the hazards we were insuring. We could work out where our properties were, we were insuring, and how exposed they were, how vulnerable they were. And that's actually just changed the way we thought about risk. It just changed the way we actually began to assess risk and what the market could do and what it could offer. What is really important is that all these models are built on assumptions, and which is why it's fantastic that you in the Philippines will now have an open access model which allows you to change and challenge those assumptions and build products which are appropriate to the people of the Philippines and appropriate to need, and also very importantly are affordable. One issue is, of course, one truth of insurance pricing is where there is uncertainty, there is cost. So the greater ability we have to have a model we can coalesce around, both the client and the insurer, and later on the reinsurer, that will actually reduce uncertainty and should allow us to, number one, design appropriate insurance products, and secondly, then begin to have insurance products which are targeted at the people we need at prices they can afford. Now, Philippines actually is an exemplar within the ASEAN market and actually beyond around having a coordinated risk management policy. The Philippines government, as you well know, has developed a government property insurance program, has issued catastrophe bonds to actually provide emergency disaster funding after an event. They have pioneered use of contingent development loans with the World Bank and more recently with the Asian Development Bank. They're looking at critical infrastructure insurance schemes, and there are a range of different initiatives in the market to actually help spread and develop catastrophe insurance throughout the Philippines and reaching a greater level of people. Lisa from Makati made some very, very good points, and one of which is actually there is still vast swathes of the population which are currently uninsured, where we do, and every study everywhere shows that if we can actually develop the spread of insurance, we can then begin to allow society to recover more quickly. We want to make sure we protect the most vulnerable. The most vulnerable people have the least to lose in terms of possessions from a Nat Cat event, but they have everything to lose in terms of their livelihood, their lives. So it's very, very important that we actually spread this insurance revolution as far as we can throughout society. Now, the thing is, of course, in the Philippines, you actually have everything. You have everything in terms of natural hazard. You have the whole gamut of risk. But the great thing is you also have the people who with the will and the skills to do it. You have a thriving local insurance industry. You actually have a great science base. You actually have your pioneers in your country of inclusive finance, inclusive insurance. So we have a strong base to build upon. What the great thing about the Oasis initiative, the flood modeling initiative is, one of the barriers to us building on that base and actually pushing insurance out into more products towards the people that need them has now been taken away. So now we have an insurance model which should allow us to develop more interesting products targeted at groups like farmers, like fisherfolk, like people working in sectors such as tourism, allow us to spread the penetration of insurance amongst the general population. So perhaps making sure that more people in Makati and Greater Manila, throughout the entire Philippines, are able to buy affordable insurance, including flood, but to cover their property, to cover their families, to cover their businesses. So the opportunity is here. So all I'd say is actually this could and should be a call to arms. We can now begin to coalesce around this model and begin to use the skills of the Philippines people, augmented by this now strong, thriving global catastrophe insurance market sector, coupled with your own strong, thriving insurance sector, to think out of the box a bit and begin to develop these new products. The challenge is there, the need is there, but also the answer is now there. So let's work together and let's make this happen. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Mr. David Simmons. The last presentation for this afternoon is on future of flood insurance and how the project's catastrophe model will be available to Philippine stakeholders. Our presenter has more than a decade's experience in catastrophe modeling and risk management. She was previously with Ayun Benfield in Singapore, where she handled delivering, interpreting, and communicating catastrophe modeling analysis. Let us welcome our speaker, Head of Catastrophe Risk Management at National Reinsurance Corporation of the Philippines, or NATRI, Ms. Cherry Lorenzo.
Thank you for the introduction, Sherwin. Now share my screen. Okay, so in this session, we will talk about flood insurance and the challenges that insurers face when dealing with this peril. We will then talk about how the Oasis model can address some of these challenges and how you, our stakeholders, can gain access to this model. Okay, so let's begin. Recent typhoons Goni, so locally called Raleigh, and Vamco, locally called Ulysses, have shown us how vulnerable we are to typhoons and its associated floods. In the Philippines, on the average, we experience 20 typhoons in a year. According to the Philippine Statistics Authority, among the major disasters from 2010 to 2019, meteorological disasters, so these are floods and typhoons, posted the highest number of incidents affecting the country. Despite this, the Philippines still has a very low insurance penetration, particularly for NatCat perils. For example, Tropical Storm Ondoy and Typhoon Pepeng in 2009 flooded approximately 80% of Metro Manila. These two typhoons cost an estimated 220 billion pesos in economic losses, equivalent to 2.7% of the country's GDP. Insured losses, on the other hand, was at 12 billion pesos only. So this means that only 5% of the total damages from the typhoon is shouldered by the insurance industry. The rest of the losses were shouldered by the government and the private sector or the property owners themselves. The Insurance Commission reports that of the 24.5 billion in gross written premiums for property in 2017, only 2.9 billion pesos are typhoon and flood coverage, or only 12% of the total. So there's clearly no lack of demand for flood insurance. And unlike fire insurance, which is widespread, flood insurance is still not very common here in the Philippines. So what are the probable reasons for such low insurance penetration rate? One explanation is the fact that people underestimate their exposure to flood risk. Another is that flood insurance involves a set of very specific challenges which restrict the commercial viability of flood insurance. Some of the challenges that insurance companies face are the following. First off, you have risk assessment. Floods are more difficult to insure other than compared to the other natural disasters. One reason is that flood comes in various forms. So we have flash floods, we have dam bursts, we have river floods, and other forms. So this makes risk assessment very difficult for insurers. The second one is risk pricing. Flooding has been traditionally been seen as uninsurable because flood risk assessment were often poor, and the information needed to estimate individual risk adequate premiums was lacking. And then the third one is exposure accumulation. One of the most significant obstacles to making flood insurance commercially viable is the challenge of building a sufficiently large portfolio that comprises of policyholders that only live in high exposed areas. So in this case, insurance will simply not work because risks should be shared with a large number of policyholders. So insurers are now faced with the dilemma of charging higher premiums or decide not to insure flood risk at all. But these challenges can be overcome with tools such as the Oasis flood model for the Philippines. Catastrophe models provide risk assessment of individual or a portfolio of risk and provide guidance to an insurer's underwriting strategy. It can also provide metrics that calculate the risk-based premiums and the technical rates. CAT models also provide various solutions for insurers to manage their portfolios, identify areas for growth, identify risk concentrations, and understand and manage drivers of risk. Apart from this, the Oasis model for flood is also a tool to enable the country to increase its disaster resilience by making catastrophe insurance more accessible and affordable to the more exposed population. Like what David Simmons said, we can develop products that will be beneficial to the more exposed population. Having said all these, let us now look at how you, our stakeholders, can gain access to the Oasis flood model for the Philippines. So there are two options available for you to access the flood model. The first option is to get a license for your organization. So you get a license to access the Philippine Catastrophe Model for Flood in the Oasis platform. When you get this, we will provide you two users for your organization who are allowed to use the tool. And then this includes 1 day of training on catastrophe modeling, using the model or the platform, and then of course, interpreting model results. Additional support will of course be charged per hour after this. And then the second option would be NATRI to model to use the catastrophe model and model your portfolio for you. This is for stakeholders who would like to who do not wish to obtain a license. So what you can do is send us your portfolio and we will run the analysis for you. And then we will send you the results. License fees for the Oasis model will be free. If you get the license, it will be free for the academe, the government, and the nonprofit sectors. And then for insurers and for profit entities, it will also be free for the first year. And then for the succeeding year, the license will be at a heavily discounted rate. When we say heavily discounted rate, this is in comparison with the commercial catastrophe model. And then if you would like us to run the catastrophe model for you, we haven't decided yet on the price, but we'll let you know soon when we already have the system. So accessing the model, all you have to do is to click on a link. So the URL is still to be determined via a web browser. So you don't need to install anything. You don't need to upgrade your system. All you need is a web browser and an internet connection. The platform will be hosted on the cloud. So computing services, storage, networking, database will be on the internet. Our IT team has already reviewed the functionalities of our cloud service provider and made sure that the data that you put in the system are secured and threat-free. The terms on confidentiality of data, which users will upload to the platform, will also be covered by a licensing agreement between NATRI and your organization. So the agreement which your organization's legal team is welcome to review. So this will include other standard clauses. So once you have fully set up your IT systems, probably by early next year, please expect an email from the NATRI Oasis team. And if you are interested in getting a license or availing of our service of running the analysis for you, you may just reply to that email. Otherwise, if you have any questions at the moment, you may also email the NATRI Oasis team at oasis@nat-re.com if you have any questions. So yeah, that's all. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much, Ms. Cherry Lorenzo. We will now ask our speakers to answer the questions that we have received through the chat or the Q&A box. So let's start the open forum. We've received a few questions here. One question that we got here is, how will the government benefit from this model? So I think probably Dicky or Claire would like to answer.
Well, let me start, and then Claire can add something as well. So one of the things that governments need to do, of course, is trying to analyze the exposure to the whole country from various significant events, as has been well explained today, in this case, of course, flood. So this would help, therefore, with the government with understanding about the risk to the whole of the Philippines and how frequent those risks might be and how severe they might be, and begin to evaluate potentially adaptation measures that could be used. So these tools are quite good, for example, for looking at things like river defenses. You could therefore evaluate the cost benefit of those river defenses. And of course, consider that in the light of risk transfer mechanisms. So I think that's one area. The other thing I would say is, I think it's really important that individuals and companies and the people in any country have a better understanding of risk. So I think what this offers as a potential is a way of having a greater common language of risk that can be shared both with governments, obviously with insurance in this case, but led by the local local scientists. So I think there's a possibility to have a better conversation in the Philippines about risk. I don't know if Claire or David indeed, or any of the colleagues would maybe add something to that.
No, I can only say, I think you expressed it very well, Dicky. I think we are specifically focusing on insurance here, but clearly the ability to actually have an open dialogue. And the thing is, actually, I missed in my quick 8-minute overview of the insurance revolution, if you like, was actually how the early models we had actually were black boxes. So we couldn't really begin to debate the assumptions within them. The assumptions like the state of current flood defenses is important, and actually having an open model like Oasis can provide that open platform for dialogue within academia, within government, then actually as a means to actually inform the public of the risks that they face and the actions that they can take to actually to mitigate those risks.
All right, thank you so much, Vicky and David. I think we're running out of time. Apologies for that, but we still have, we can entertain just one more question. So the question here is, how accurate is the Oasis model compared to other commercial catastrophe models?
I think let me have a quick go at that. Can you just repeat the first that question again? I missed the very beginning.
The question is, how accurate is the Oasis model compared to the other commercial catastrophe models? So it's with regard to the accuracy of the model.
Yeah, thank you. Now I understand. Well, interesting question, because actually I think I would argue that the most important thing in these models isn't really accuracy, because there's a very, very strong danger of what we might call false precision. So to David's point just now, one of the most important things about these models is having an understanding about the uncertainty. That's really what this is all about. It's an appreciation of how to manage uncertainty, or decision, sometimes called decision-making under uncertainty. So accuracy is a very elusive quality in these models, and I would suggest perhaps not the most important thing. But there are some things that perhaps the person asking that question was getting to. So for example, if you look at the global commercial models that are available for flood in the Philippines, none of them have access to the high resolution digital elevation model that's been discussed today, that is part of the significant asset of the people of the Philippines. And part of that means it stays for models that are in the Philippines. So nobody had access to that apart from you for this model, because it's really your model, of course. And so that means that we've got some high resolution data that's going into that. And then I think if you look at the vulnerability functions that are being worked on, and these will develop over time, again, we're using your knowledge of the building vulnerability in the Philippines, and that's going to give a really strong local drive to these the model, and therefore the decisions that can be made from it. That's what gives, so it's the transparency, it's the high resolution data, it's the local knowledge, it's the local science. That's what sets you up to have, I would say, the most useful model for understanding flood in the Philippines. And I'm not sure I would want to describe any model as the most accurate. That's a very, very hard test to have. But I hope your question, the person who asked the question, appreciates. I'm supportive of what I think they're asking for, but I would just frame it slightly differently.
Thank you so much, Dicky. And I think it looks like we have run out of time, so I guess we will finish the Q&A here. For all other questions or concerns, please feel free to send us an email at oasis@nat-3.com. That ends our open forum and our program for today. Thank you for your time, for the participants in sending in your questions. And now to formally close the program, may I please invite our project partner, who is a technical advisor for the German Red Cross, forecast-based financing projects in the Philippines. He was the Chief Science Research Specialist from December 2011 to December 2013 in Disaster Risk Exposure Assessment for Mitigation, or UP-DREAM program, and a lecturer at the Department of Geodetic Engineering from the University of the Philippines, Diliman, Engineer John Louis Fabila.
Maraming salamat, Sherwin. I hope you can hear me. Again,
Yes.
good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I speak in behalf of the University of the Philippines when I say it has been a pleasure working with risk and insurance experts, climatologists, and catastrophe modelers, fellow academics, government and finance industry participants, and local decision makers, to name a few. One of the niche expertise here in the Department of Geodetic Engineering has always been the use of spatial data for resource and hazard modeling, and it was eye-opening for us to see how that would translate to risk transfer and loss modeling. We've always maintained in the university that the output of our researches should be able to create value. That's important to us. And that the data and information output of our researches should result in actionable analysis, and that these information should have a trickle-down effect to our communities. And we think this open source, user-friendly, web-based platform in risk modeling has been a major step towards that. But just as we value the creation of value in our researches, so to speak, we also value the people and the collaboration that we've been gifted with. So we would like to take this opportunity to thank Stefan and the Katrisk team, David and our friends from Willis Towers Watson, Anne and Christoph from the PIK team, and Claire and Dicky and the whole Oasis LMF group for sharing their invaluable expertise. We would like to thank Sir June and the Pag-asa team, for whom we've always had collaborations before. And last but not least, we'd like to thank Alan, Sherry, and the team in the NATRI for involving us in this worthwhile endeavor. Maraming salamat. Even though we are at the end of this project, and that our individual steps from now would lead us to different trails, may our future lead us to cross paths again, as there is still a lot to be done and a lot of conversations in risk modeling to be made. 1,000 thanks to everyone who attended today, and I hope for your continued health, and bid you all a good evening.
Thank you very much, Engineer John Louis Fabila, and to all our speakers and participants. And thank you, everyone. Again, my name is Sherwin, and it has been a pleasure being with all of you today. Please keep safe, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.